Welcome to the Hedgineer Podcast, hosted by Michael Watson.
Welcome back to Season 2 of the Hedgineer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Watson, where we talk about data, AI, and technology in the hedge fund, asset management, and prop trading space. So for today's guest, we have a guy that I actually first reached out to maybe like 5 years ago in the middle of the meme stock boom of 2020, 2021. Via LinkedIn, because he built this really cool CLI tool called the Gamestonk Terminal. And it was built for retail investors that didn't have access to a lot of like fundamental and pricing data and equity markets, couldn't afford a Bloomberg terminal, and put it out on, I think it was WallStreetBets. And I came across it when I was running the technology teams at Citadel. I was like, dude, this guy like really understands how to contextualize data in a way that just makes sense. Like, let me reach out to him on LinkedIn. So I shot him like a random DM and I'm like, hey, I think you did an awesome job contextualizing some kind of heady concepts in like fundamental equity research with market data and fundamental, like stitching stuff together with probably like the Yahoo Finance API and some other stuff. I'd love to interview you, or actually see if you're interested in joining the team. And then we talked for a little bit. It kind of like went cold, and then I've been following him ever since. And he launched this like pretty awesome company, OpenBB, that has built a data platform for integrating various different financial data sources, fundamental, macro, equity, crypto, market data, like fundamental data, in a open source tool that pretty much anybody can use. And it's kind of like taken this amazing pathway, and I've kind of just following it on the sidelines as I've also been building technology in the space. And so I finally reached out to you after 4 years and shot you again a random DM in LinkedIn, and it's like, dude, it'd be awesome to have you come on the podcast. You replied like right away. And it's been great to reconnect. So Didier, welcome to the podcast.
Essentially, when you sent me the first message, you were one of the first people from like a big firm, because you were at Citadel at the time. You're the technical director or something like that?
Yeah, managing director of equities. Yeah.
So you sent that message over and you said like, amazing work at Gamestonk. Like don't listen to everything you hear, because Citadel was on the press because of Gamestonk Terminal. And I took that screenshot, and that was part of our first deck like 6 months later, when we actually ended up raising almost $9 million.
No way, that's
Your
awesome.
name was there, so like the investors saw like that was, I think, the only quote that we had from someone on the industry. It's literally the screenshot of your message. So when you reached back out, like I knew full well who you were, because I remembered like how much confidence that gave me around like building the project.
Dude, awesome. Yeah, honestly, that's such an honor, because I've been following what you've been building kind of like on the sidelines for like the last 4 years. And dude, honestly, that's such an honor, because I'm so impressed by what you've built since then, man. So that I don't know what to say. I'm speechless. I'd love to like give the audience a little bit of a walkthrough of like your journey as being like a developer and then entrepreneur, building out an open source data platform and UI for asset managers like in hedge funds, like, but also retail investors as well, and kind of starting from the latter and working more to the former. And just fill us in. What did you build? How have you gone about building it? What's the journey been like?
Yeah, so my background is I have a control systems master's from Imperial, and then I finished that. I started working as a software engineer and then as a centrifuge engineer, where I was implementing like algorithms, writing code in like C, C++, and then simulations like in Python. Basically at the time I was really excited about the space of AI and like Python, and so I was doing like a lot of side projects. And one day I got approached by my previous maths teacher from my university in Portugal, where I did my bachelor, and he was working on modeling and forecasting of financial time series. So that was my first contact with finance. And so he basically challenged me to write the code behind his PhD thesis. And I was like, yeah, that sounds really fun, because like I do the nice part, which is the coding, and I don't have to do the 200-page report of the thesis, So I work on with him on that like for 8 months. And after that, I was like really excited because I feel like there's something that like pulls like engineers and like, to the stock market, trying to predict like what's happening and things like that. And so I started then and I had some savings. At this time I had maybe like 2-3 years of work experience. So I had some savings. I was in London. And so I started spending time like trying to understand the markets. And so, you start on the fundamentals, you then start understanding the macro. And the problem for me was that I was like an engineer, so I like to automate a lot of things. I didn't like to spend time doing like repeated tasks. But in the stock market, I felt that all I was doing is a lot of manual work, and that manual work was increasing. Like, I was looking into like fundamentals, macro, then I found out that, you can look into like insider trading. I started looking into insider trading, and then I learned that, okay, actually sentiment is really important, so I can get the data from Twitter and then run a sentiment model, and it just starts like piling up and piling up. So I went from, spending like an evening researching a company and buying a few shares to spending the entire weekend doing that same process. And the problem is not just the company's expansion, is that same company, if I analyze it like in 2-3 months, like the data that I used in the past is no longer relevant. I was like, yeah, this doesn't make sense. Like it just doesn't work. And at this stage, I had like a notebook with all the list of things that I did. And so like all the steps and everything that I wanted to check. And then at the end, I would have like, like yes or no, like, run a regression model and it's like compare with the price and whatever. And so I had this notebook that just kept on getting bigger. And basically what happened, and my dashboard was just like a lot of tabs open all the time. And then some of the apps like would make me log in again, and it's like, 2FA, and it's like just so annoying. And then you paid like $20 here, but the data, you couldn't work it with the other like feed from another data vendor, another one just provide the data through an API. And I was like, this is super annoying. And basically this was during the COVID time, and it was during the GameStop craze. And so my flight actually got canceled, and I was meant to visit my parents over Christmas. And I was like, what am I going to do in this week? And then I looked at that notebook with like all the steps that I did. I was like, I'm going to automate this. And so I was a big fan of open source because I had been like sharing what I was learning on open source on GitHub, and I went to look for projects. I didn't find anything. I didn't find anything that I could build upon. I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna start building these myself in a way that I want to like speed run my entire process, so that at the end I can run like what I called a routine in the early days, saying like run this routine for Palantir, and he would just grab all of these data, technical analysis indicators, and he would put it all into one place, and then I could watch it and then say, okay, here's my decision. And so I started building that, and I worked with it for like 2 months on top of my full-time job. And then after I was like, this is in a good shape. Like I think people will understand what I'm trying to do. And it was like a command line interface that basically had these categories, and then you'd go into like equity, and then like TA for technical analysis, and then like EMA for exponential moving average, or like EMA and then dash, and then you select like the window size and things like that. So it was just like, for me, it was really easy to build because I had experience from my job in Python and like doing command line interface work. And at the same time, it was really fast because it was like command based. And so I made it open source. And then I shared it on Reddit. We went viral there on like WallStreetBets. And then someone said you should put it on Hacker News. We went viral there. And so the project got like 4,000 stars in like less than 24 hours. And this was like 4 years and a half ago at the time. So yeah, that's how we started.
So then how do you take 4,000 stars and turn that into a company? Like what do you do from there?
So what happened was that with that, the stars, a lot of people started contributing. Like I remember telling my at the time girlfriend, telling her like it would be really cool if this project got like 20 stars, something like that. And I felt like I was spending a lot of time on Reddit, understanding what all they were doing research. I was literally learning from it. The only reason I actually put it on Reddit was because I was like, I learned so much from people here, retails from here, that I feel like is the least I can do is to put it out. So, and at the same time, I was also learning. So I felt like I know that if I put it out, someone else will contribute to the project in a way that I will learn, right? And that happened. Like that immediately happened. Like a few days after it was live, like people were adding like Forex data. I had never traded Forex at the time. Started adding options, crypto. So they understood fundamentally that the project wasn't just focused on the equity because it was meant to just be equity. Like it was focused on, it's more about the infrastructure and the way that the APIs were plugged in. Because the way it worked, and this was kind of my underlying understanding when I started the project, was that I went through all of these different data vendors and I understood they all have a similar go-to-market, which is you sign up, they give you data for free up to a certain amount, and then you pay. You either pay, like, say, $50 a month. What does that give you? Sometimes it gives you more requests per minute. Sometimes it gives you more time historical. Sometimes it gives you access to different data sets. Now, the thing is, like, within equities, there are maybe 100 different data vendors. Within crypto, there's another like 50 or 60. And their free tiers differ between each other, the data that they offer. So if you actually combine all of these free API tiers from all of these vendors, is a ton of data. That was the basis of Gamestonk Terminal, was that like free tier. And because you had to insert your API key that gave you access to the free tier, if you wanted 30 years of financials instead of 5, you just replace the API key. The product is the same. And so like people could spend as much on the product as they wanted, essentially, to get like more data or less, depending on what is their workflow. And so people started like coming into the project, adding Forex, adding crypto. It started like creating like this like vibrant community. I had to create a Discord because then people were like, oh, we need a place to discuss these things. And we went like to like, I don't know, like 6,000 or so like people like really fast. And so I had like my full-time job, and then I would get home, work until like, 1 a.m. on it, wake up early before my job to make sure that the pull requests were going well, give comments, and then at lunchtime I would like do it, and so it's like really it was a bit too much, and then but that kept going, and essentially Joseph Jacks from OSS Capital reached out to us around June, and he said, I saw your launch back in February, but like I've just keep seeing the project trending on GitHub. It just keeps appearing, and like the traction is crazy. People are just like adding like more data. They are adding like different like categories of data, and it's very exciting. Like let's have a shot. And first he actually talked with one of our contributors, and he met him on his like honeymoon, because he was based in the US. So he had his honeymoon in San Francisco, and so he met like one of the first contributors of the project there about like what we were working and how exciting it was. And then he spoke with me after, and he's like, where do you want to take the project? And for me, I was like, look, I'm using this for myself. I'm like, I can be here like, for years, because I'm using it for my own personal investments. And so with more data, I can make better decisions. I can be like faster to market. I can find more alpha between all of these different data combined in a way that like the data communicates with each other, because it's kind of all in the same place, if that makes sense. And so it really liked this like value proposition, and also the fact that I wanted to have it open, because for me, like the mode is more around how you combine the data, not necessarily the data itself, if that makes sense. And so, and then we discussed about him investing money in the company, and we ended up like raising in total 8.9 million on a seed round from JJ and OSS Capital, but also Naval Ravikant, Elad Gil, Ram Shriram, and a few of our advisors as well.
Awesome, man. Really cool. So like, let's kind of touch on the concept where there's not a moat on the data, but there's, what you're saying, like a moat around the way in which the data is constructed and integrates with each other.
Yeah.
I'm curious on like your thoughts. How do you build a platform that is open, but integrates different proprietary or like bespoke data sets in a way that they all fit together? Like, how do you think about join keys on instrument identifiers like OpenFiggy or on a QSIP or a CDAL so that these different data sets can fit together, even though they might be using a different symbology?
Yeah, so that's where it gets tricky. So we don't go onto that step of standardization. We do the standardization we do is like, for instance, let's say that you want to get consumer price index data, for instance. There will be a command that's called obb.economy.cpi to get that data. Then within that function, how you access the data, you can have like start_date, for instance, and that's where you define the starting date, and there's the date time that you use, and that date time you can trust that it will work for any of the providers that support that economy CPI data. So we do all the routing behind the scenes, and then another parameter is the provider. So the provider may be Fred, or it may be company X, or it may be company Y. So we do the standardization at the parameter input level and at the output level, which is like, okay, how do I expect the data to come? Like what I expect to be like the time series, or for instance, if you're just getting market data, what is going to be the naming of the columns on a data frame for like high, low, close, volume? Like, and we guarantee that those names are the same across the vendors because we standardize that part of it. But the symbology is down to the vendor. So like different vendors, for instance, the name of the parameter is thicker, for instance, across all of them, but the tickers may be different between the vendors, and we don't go there because that's too much out of the standardization like framework that we are implementing, if that makes sense.
Totally. And it's complicated. So, but at least then, for example, you have CPI. And so I think CPI is officially published via BLS. But there might be different vendors that you're getting CPI from. And so are you expecting that metric CPI is been standardized by the vendors themselves, and then you have this current common taxonomy around the metric that whenever you access through, it sounded like bb.economy.cpi, then there's different sources that you pull from, but there's like the standardization of the metric layer.
Correct. That is correct, yes. But the data then, it's entirely up to the vendor. So we just touch the way to call it and the way to parse it. And so we call it like a TET, like transform, extract, transform again, so that you know what to input regardless of the vendor you're working on, and you know what you are going to get regardless of the vendor. But if the vendor has, for instance, an issue on the data, we are not responsible because the user decides which vendor they utilize each time they call a function. We just do the routing to the right one, for instance. Because OPB.economy.cpi is actually not like, it's nothing. It's just like a framework that we use to organize the information, which is because I wanted to have it organized like this. And then I can do something like OPB.economy, and I see like all of these list of massive commands that are helpful to get the data. And then in each of these, you may have like, 5 different vendors, or in some, maybe just 2, like BLS or IMF. But the data is always down to the vendor. So sometimes what would happen in the early days is like people say, okay, this data is not good enough. It's like, okay, but you are using data from Yahoo Finance, as the ultimate endpoint where it comes from. So, that is not our fault.
Sure. I mean, another question, and this is not an easy problem to get right, is the taxonomy. Like economy as the naming convention for economic related data. Like how do you come up with the names? And so there's also change management is tough. Like maybe 5 years ago, it was right to use taxonomy as the classification and then these other metrics underneath it. And now 5 years later, you're like, oh, I want to change it. But you have this existing framework that a lot of people have their code bases and dependencies built around. You can't just change that. How has that like affected you over the last like couple years, and how do you kind of think about like the taxonomy and the naming structure and how you manage change around it?
Yeah, so that was actually probably one of the trickiest things, because I mean, if you think about it, is a two-edged sword, right? Because in one way you may say, okay, we don't do any taxonomy, but then it's like less helpful if you want to tell someone wants to check what is in the economy category. But on the other side, you can be too much opinionated and you don't agree with that opinion, right? And so we try to strike the right balance. And this was in the early days why it was important to have like the community and in the open, because we could discuss where things should fall, and we even like rebranded. Like I think at some point we had like digital assets, and then we called it like crypto or something like that, and it's like small things, but we also allowed you to have access to the underlying like, API from the vendor. So you could have access it from what we call the router, right? So these nomenclature, or you could do something like OBB.provider.thread. And then you would basically eat the endpoint from thread for the whatever data they provided. And furthermore, like the project was literally MIT open source. So if people were not happy with the taxonomy, it was as easy as like forking the project and like, just changing that. So yeah.
Awesome. But it's not just a CLI. I actually want to come back to the CLI component because I think it was maybe a scenario where the CLI was great, but then the UI was more valuable. And now I think we're almost in a world where maybe the CLI, with how you use it with AI, is maybe more valuable than the UI. But let's not jump to that end game, but the intermediate game is like there's also like a pretty cool UI that you guys built around it. It like spins up. I went to the domain and was able to spin up my own workspace, which was awesome. What was that like going from like, hey, we have a CLI, you want an interface, and then now you have something that's like widgetized and pretty cool. Like, how did that transform? So
there was an evolution there. So the open source was actually just a CLI in the early days, and then what we started understanding is like some people were forking the project, and we were using the model view controller pattern, right? And people were killing the view. they were not using the CLI. They were just using the model and the controller, and then they were building stuff on top. So they were interested on the SDK, actually, not on the CLI itself. They used the CLI for exploration to see what data was available, like out of the box quickly, and check what data they could get. And then they used the fork project as the SDK to build something on top. And that was a super interesting insight. So the first thing then that we done was refactoring the project to be like SDK first, so that you could get the data like through Python, and then you could the CLI was basically a wrapper above. That was kind of the first iteration of major iteration of the product. Then what happened was like this was an open source project. We were not monetizing it at all, and it was really hard to monetize in the first place because we didn't own the data. So because we're not on the owners of the data, and we don't even have the rights to redistribute it. So the way you would use it is you basically install the CLI on your machine. And when you put your API key for the vendors, it's you, Michael, that are getting the data so they can track the usage. And that's why like data vendors like loved us. And we had 100 plus at some point, data vendors like incorporated on the CLI, because like individual users would connect their own API keys and then they would subscribe, right? But we were not seeing anything out of this because we couldn't redistribute like the data per se, right? And the problem as well is that CLI was a tricky one because I think now CLIs are becoming popular again, but at the time, like, it was like a love-hate. Like, there was no in between. People either loved it or they hated it, right? And so for us, when we started like talking with people, it's like, okay, the CLI may not be the best format because you were essentially like writing a command that brought in data, but that data was opening it like in a new window, and then we built like cool technology to create like an interactive like window that on the terminal. But it wasn't super useful because the data was like static in time. So for instance, let's say that you wrote all these commands and they popped up in the way that you wanted. Like those commands then that was it. Like when you stopped like using it and you came back, like you had to run the command again for those shards to come on. So there was not like a notion of like a state, right? And then what we started understanding as well, we started having this notion that like retail investors like don't really pay for like research. Like there's a lot of money to be made at the execution level, but we actually strongly believe, I'll die on that hill, that like there is not money to be made on the research aspect. There's very few like retail investors that will pay for like research, right? And there's a lot like people joke it's like a casino, but it kind of is. And then we at around this time like we introduced like analytics into the project, because before we didn't have. We just had like the number of like downloads of the terminal because we built an installer, and we built analytics and started like seeing people like from JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, like signed up for the product, and we had no idea that we had people from the industry actually using the project. And so it was like super interesting. And so we started doing these interviews and understanding like, okay, what are they doing with our project? And ultimately they were using it at home because they didn't have the permission to use it on the financial firms. And it was because there was no like open data like product where they could do their own research once they were at home, because they were sophisticated investors. It's just that they wanted to utilize something at home that they didn't have access. I was like, okay, that's a super like a great like insight. And then we started understanding like their patterns. What do they do? We started like learning about it. And we realized that like you either have like products like Bloomberg, like CapIQ, like FactSet that are like very opinionated towards like a specific workflow, right? And that is it. Like if you want to change it, you can't really like change the product. If you want to add data, you can't really, because these companies are data companies at the core, but they offer you the data through a UI, but also through an API, right? So what happens when you want to bring more data? You can't. And the problem as well is like you have this platform that is kind of one size fits all, but like each person that spends time doing like research and analysis and portfolio managers, like they have somewhat different workflows and they can't really like control the workflow in those products. And so we started thinking, it's like, look, this is kind of the same problem we're solving. It's just that we don't have the interface. And so we started thinking about like, okay, but what would be today the best interface that is customizable, that someone can build something on top? And there's nothing. It was essentially people building things from scratch, most of the times using Streamlit, for instance. But it's really bare bones. It looks nothing like, a FactSet or a CapIQ, right? And so for us, it's like, okay, like we understand what we need to do. We need to build this enterprise workspace that allows firms to bring in any data feeds that they want, and so that it looks like a CapIQ, but for their specific workflows, whatever that workflow is. And so when we started like building that idea, we built like everything from scratch, right? The concept of like widgets, of metadata, how it moves around, how you can have like folders with the information. Like ChatGPT was announced. So we were able to think about how does these widgets work in the world of AI. And for us, it's like, okay, the data needs to be accessible to the human that is going to visualize it, but also to the AI agent that is going to live inside this workspace, that is going to have access to this data the same way that the analyst has. And so this is why today, when you go into workspace, you have the dashboard, and then you have an agent on the side that has access to all the data that is on the dashboard, whatever that dashboard is, maybe crypto, maybe like client advisory workflow, your portfolio, and then you can combine data from multiple data feeds, which is ultimately like how Gamestonk Terminal and then OpenBB started, was with that notion that you can combine data from all of these feeds on our workspace. And then like, we started like talking with like firms, and they started thinking about like, okay, but we need to run this on-prem because it's like our proprietary data and it gets like more valuable, and we want to have our own AI agents. And so today that workspace is closed source, the interface, but we have like a lot of open source examples on data that you can bring. We actually have a product in this segment that is coming soon. And then AI agents as well that they can bring. An AI agent may be for like specific workflows, like for instance, for draft investor letter based on data that is on the workspace with your portfolio, or maybe like another agent that is really good at portfolio commentary or something like that. But it's up to the firms to own the data, the AI agents, and the ultimate like workflow, which they already do today, and we just provide them with the workspace to build that out.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that sounds like you're starting to get into is something that I've seen you post a little bit about, and that is whether you're in the business of being a MCP data provider or an MCP data consumer, like the client versus server model. And a lot of major players have this conflict. Like if you're CapIQ or you are FactSet, you have two products. You have your data product, and then you have your workspace, your terminal. And you make a lot of money off of the terminal on top of the data. But when you can just take that data, expose it to Claude Enterprise Chat or Chat GPT and press a connection, have access to it, you can now get similar analytics and workflows that are customized to you, joined with all of your other data without having to use the FactSet workspace or CapIQ workbench. You still want the data, but you don't need the UI point and click platform anymore. And if you need that, you can sometimes go and build it yourself. And so that's difficult for a data provider that also has a terminal and analytics environment to accept, because in order to push data and monetize the opportunity of delivering data to a intelligence layer that's an AI workflow tool, you're essentially accepting that client doesn't need to buy the workspace anymore. So like internal stakeholders that are a sales manager of either one of those two products are saying like, no, we cannot allow this because that's going to eat into my end of year bonus. You're basically going to like get rid of my job, and they're going to hold on to that until the company is forced to make that change. Companies that are just data first, they don't have to worry about it. Like I was talking to Thomas last week at Delupa. I was like, hey, we have no UI. We only have Delupa API, and we have the Excel workbook plugin. So like there's nothing to cannibalize if I expose it to as a connection through another MCP client to use, because like I have no business to lose. And so who's the very first person combining with FIS, financial services for Claude? Delupa, because they had no business that was getting cannibalized by making that easily accessible there. All the other providers, like they're like, we want to integrate, but like there's going to be some winners and losers internally, and those stakeholders haven't necessarily all been wrangled together.
That's
So how do you think about that, right? Because you also have a workspace, right? And you do have an element where it is an open data model where anybody can add their own data in, so it's not necessarily a walled garden.
We don't care about data because we don't own that.
You're not monetizing it anyways.
We are completely out of the data business. So like early story when I knew that like these are data businesses that are selling UI as a distribution mechanism, but they are data businesses at the core. When I understood that was when we were building the workspace. So we just came out of beta like in October last year. When we were building that workspace, we got quoted from a data vendor a specific price for the data feeds, and we had to describe what our product was. And I was like, if you are in the data business, like, why do you really care about the product and who is it targeting? It's like, okay, fair. And we wrote down, and they quoted as a price. And it was like, okay, it's not too bad. And this was because we wanted to have some data out of the box on the workspace to give an idea of people what they can do, not because we wanted to become like a Bloomberg, for instance, and start owning our own data. So it was more about showing what is possible. And then they found out that the OpenBB workspace, they looked at it, they saw one early demo, and they saw that it was like enterprise facing. And so they took that quote back and they said, no, now the number is like, it was at least an order of magnitude bigger, and it was limited for like 200 people or something like ridiculous. And like that was like more than 1 year ago. And so that was when I understood that, okay, there's going to be a conflict here that is bound to happen. And I think that MCP now just makes that like a bit more clear to everyone that's going to happen. But it started some time ago already, also with like things like Snowflake, for instance, right? Because Snowflake has an awesome data marketplace, for instance, right? And the problem is like, okay, you are a data company and you have your own UI, but now you have these gigantic firms that are consuming data from Snowflake. And a few years ago, these gigantic firms would go onto all of these data vendors and grab the data. But now they have like all of their data stored on Snowflake. And so they are going to clients that want to sell to them, telling, if your data is not on Snowflake, I'm not going to consume it. And that's a complete shift of paradigm, because now these vendors are forced to push their data on Snowflake. All of them today put their data on Snowflake. And so that's the first, like, I have a post on this that I need to share soon. So first thing that I saw is like, okay, there's this data marketplace component where now these data marketplaces have data from all these vendors where they are competing with each other, but the data lives in the data marketplace, whether it's Snowflake, Databricks, or AWS. But like Snowflake is really good at the data storage, data manipulation, but doesn't as like a native UI, for instance. And this is where we come in. We are like the stage after, which is like closer to value, closer to insights, in our opinion. And it's really focused on like financial workflows, essentially. So like our ultimate goal is to be in a position where we have this interface that you can select whatever data you want. Like, we don't care. We are in the business of building the best like possible like financial workspace so that you can achieve your full like workflows. As a matter of fact, like the way we started building these widgets capabilities for users to bring data onto our product was in the way that data became accessible to the agent. So essentially, we started building MCP concept before MCP, right? But we built our own protocol, and we are not the size of an Anthropic, so we cannot set a standard like they can, right? But essentially, when like users now build like different applications on top of our workspace and they connect their data, the AI agent on the side can always retrieve data to it. If it's a table, it knows that it has to do text to SQL. If it's like a PDF, you can do RAG. Then we have an open source like repo with examples of agents to process like PDFs, to process tables, so you can see how to use it. But that's essentially like the MCP server and MCP client relationship, right? And so now, but how do we think about MCP server and MCP clients? So now we are in a position that we are actually going to release soon the MCP client feature so that users can connect their own MCP servers. Because for us, we built the pipeline for users to build data onto the products to be visual first, to the concept of widgets that makes it accessible to the agent as well on the side. But MCP is AI first. So essentially, we allow now users to connect their MCP servers onto Workspace without requiring to see the UI. So it's even better, for instance, for tools, for like things like web search or something that you don't really record the UI and you just want to have the AI agent having access to it is where it's more impactful. And so it's funny because I know you interviewed Kirk from Carbon Arc. And so we started trying to integrate some of their data into the product just to show as an example of how it would look. And then we had some shift of priorities. Because it takes a bit of time just because you want to create like a compelling like widget that does show something like fundamental, right? And then they told us, oh, we actually have an MCP server now. And I replied them immediately, send me the MCP server link and give me the authorization credentials because I had an account with them. And they sent it that, and I connected with OpenBB immediately, and it was funny because then we hopped on a call with them, and I opened Claude and I opened OpenBB, and I connected both, and then I asked like the same question, and both like replied. And then on OpenBB, because it's really focused on like financial like workflows, like you are then able to take the content, whether it creates like a table, you put it into the workspace next to the data that you already have, wherever that data is. So it's not just focused on like AI like first, like just chatting interface, but it's focused on like this like two-dimensional like workspace that the agent has access to, and now has access to external like tooling, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And what are your thoughts on, because it sounds like you've already done the heavy lifting of being able to create your own MCP-like protocol, and you've done the normalization and standardization, but just taking one additional layer of that, making that, just putting MCP on top of that, and then allowing somebody else to be the MCP client, and then OpenBB does the normalization. And you almost end up in a similar type of catch-22 as something like a cap IQ.
No, because there's two products, right? And we completely like distance them. So if you go onto our website, you actually cannot see anything about our open source project because we don't make money there. We have like 1-2 engineers working on it for the community, honestly. And we just allow firms to use the open source project if they want to integrate like any type of like data that they want, or use the integrations that we have there, like BLS, IMF, and I use those to them. So I run that open source project and I integrate the data onto our workspace. But that's an example. I could integrate data from there the same way that I can integrate data from DataBent or Benzinga or any other data source, completely separate from the open source project. And the workspace is the closed source product, is where we make money. That's where we implemented the MCP client. And so there's not, for us, we are not in the data business. The open source project is like fully open source. Yeah.
Awesome. I think the Carbon Arc point is, I think, really interesting because they're kind of in this interesting business model where you pay per insight or you pay per query, and you don't have to subscribe to the entire data set. And you potentially allow a larger audience to get access to a proprietary data set. They don't pay for like the full license enterprise model. They just pay for what they use. And the model, it's like the language model, the MCP server determines based off of what you're asking, what data do you actually need, and let's just have you pay for this one response set, opposed to pay for like an annual license of something that you're only using a couple times. And I thought it's a pretty amazing concept because like you might have 1,000 different data sources that are theoretically valuable to you, and you want to use them in a production research environment. They're not just testing, but like they might be valuable to you, but just once or twice for one bespoke use case. But if you have to subscribe for an enterprise license for all 1,000 of those data sources, various different alternative data providers, your budget is going to very quickly turn to like 8, maybe 9 figures if it's like everything. And nobody can afford that. But if you pay per use, and something like a Carbon Arc is able to then have their own licenses and work out a monetization model with a data provider, and they arbitrate when that data is accessed, they track it, and then they make sure there's like a good, almost a fractional licensing model for each one of these data sets, that there's some pretty big opportunity there.
I think there is, but I think that the problem with MCP, and like I love MCP. I just like, I posted about like how I use like MCP with Figma and Cloud Code to make like mockups happen and things like that. But the problem with it that I find in terms of like market data is that you still want to check for the raw data that the API is consuming, right? Because like you are putting all of your fate on the AI model that is consuming that data. And that's the only thing that right now, I feel like at some point is like, it's not going to be a problem. And maybe like AI shot only is going to be the solution in the future. But this is like why, like, I don't think most companies in the AI space, like they started with the AI shotting like interface. We didn't start there because we believe that like workspace, like a dashboard interface is still the primary like communications for like investors, like PMs, like analysts, CIOs, because like it's more like 2 dimensions. You can look at the data, you can like find insights that the AI cannot. And so I feel like the AI for us is like complementary on top of that vision, on top of like the entire like workspace with all of these data combined together. I feel like AI is best when you are very like, you know exactly what you want. You will know what you want. Like for instance, you want to write a draft investor letter based on like a few metrics, and you write that and you know like what's the output because you can see like what is happening. Or maybe you want to add something to your memory, for instance. That's kind of more like the tool worlding of the MCP server. Like those are like concrete actions. But for instance, if you want to look at your portfolio and like understand like, you know, what, like based on the last headlines, like what are risks here that I'm not seeing or something like that, the AI agent will do good work because he will get the data like latest, for instance, on the workspace. He can see the portfolio and then he can go search the news. But you may still want to look at the portfolio yourself. There may be something that the AI is missing, and you still want to make sure that the right like data is being used. Because if it tells you to rebalance like significantly, you're like, okay, is this true? Like, how do you validate if you cannot see the underlying data that was used, right? Because it gives you the answer, and the answer is great, but sometimes you want to see the underlying data, and I think it's still missing that component, which like our workspace kind of solves when the data is integrated through the widgets.
Yeah, totally. Want to go back to like the CLI component. There's been like a huge explosion, and I live and breathe in I think CLI tools now that are wrapping. I live and breathe in Cloud Code, like to be honest. And exposing CLI tools back to Cloud Code has been like for me more powerful than MCP servers. And there's been a couple things that have been really big unlocks in my workflow when working with Cloud Code CLIs, and one of them is taking advantage of PEP 7233. It was a Python enhancement proposal added like a couple years ago where you can define the dependencies of a Python script in a script tag at the very top of the file instead of a requirements.txt or a project.toml or a .conda file. And then UV by Astral natively respects that and will install those packages and the Python interpreter on the fly. So if you have, let's say, 10 different CLI tools that are in a repo that Cloud Code has access to, each one of those CLIs might have a different Python interpreter in theory, or a different combination of libraries that might be used. And normally there's like some process of making sure that they have a common set of dependencies. But because of PEP 7233 or 723, and the way that UV does install so blazingly fast, Claude can go and pull in and can go execute those CLIs in an iterative fashion and start combining them together. And me as a user doesn't have to worry about the compatibility of the different CLIs across each other. So I can just pull down a CLI from one dev to another dev to a research manager, and they might be using different packages, and then just make sure just that CLI in a single script is accessible to Claude. And there's no dependency management. It's completely managed within the CLI itself. And then if I, with like a Cloud Code sub-agent, if I register a specific workflow and that workflow has a specific CLI that it can use, let's say for me it'll be like risk decomposition or risk manager CLI, or and the agent has context around what you should be thinking about for risk management. So like it's like, hey, there's 5 different types of risks that you should be looking for. One is going to be like factor risk. The other one is going to be just market risk. Other one is upcoming events that are idiosyncratic to the name. And one other risk might be like how diversified we are across our brokers, or like any sort of liquidation risk. And there's like 3 different, let's say like if there's one CLI for all of that, different deterministic functions that need to be called in the risk manager CLI. So I can then just use Cloud Code without a UI and have a Cloud Code agent defined for my risk manager, and then have a deterministic API that's going to go and query that stuff. It could be coming directly from OpenBB.risk, and that's like the underlying data sources, and put that on a schedule. Throw that like on a cron tab. So like Cloud Code SD, like there's the Cloud Code way that you can call it when you type in Claude, but you can do Claude-P and then pass in your prompt. And then in that prompt, it can say, call out to this sub-agent and run all of the risk requests within that. And so it's going to call out to the sub-agent. Sub-agent's going to iterate through everything that you've told it to do with your CLI. And if there's anything that it's flagged, it might go and you tell it to do something, send an email, send like an API request maybe to OpenBB Terminal, or send a Slack message, and run that every day. Or run that on some sort of trigger. That could be part of an Airflow DAG, or it can be part of like some other pipeline or event manager. And all it is a CLI with a language model having access to data and then making decisions calling out to other CLIs. It's like turtles all the way down. And it's so easy. It's like there's no magic sauce, or there's no like very complicated technology going on. if you accept that whatever a language model does, you understand high level how it does, but you don't need to go completely down to like the transformers and the way that the weights are constructed. You're just like, hey, commercial models are taking advantage of that or are providing that for me, and I'm just going to take advantage of them as best I can. It's been very powerful for me. And then
that's an awesome flow. How do you deal with the explainability, right? Because like the more complex it does, is like the more mind blowing for you, but like the harder it is to track what happens, right? Like when I use Cloud Code, for instance, for coding, like I have the VS Code always open. And so I see what he's doing and then I review. And I mean, in fact, when I do the pull request, then, you spend time on the GitHub page to check what's going on. So how do you do that in this context?
So a couple things. One is I'm not using it to write code. Okay. I'm using it to make a decision, and like all I'm using is three parts. Like one is the context that maybe I'm writing around risk, or I have somebody else that's a risk manager write that context. Yep. The tool that's providing very clean and accurate data, and then the last part is the language model has intelligence. But the output of this is not to write code or not to create a file. It's to like do some analysis and make a decision. And then as part of that, I might define in the steps to say like, oh, now we have to do a, let's say an analysis of factor exposure based off of a given portfolio. And then there's a CLI that will do that risk decomposition for me. I can then say like, I need you to document the results of this in both JSON and in a markdown file, store that in today's location for the risk report run. And then if you do trigger anything if you do identify anything that needs to be escalated, make sure you include both the structured file as well as the write-up in an example of the query to reproduce it and then send that to a user. And so it auto-gens that, and then it goes back to a user, and a user then sees that alert, and they see the analysis, and they say, like, oh yeah, I maybe have too much exposure in long-term or like short-term momentum because like I bought a bunch of Tesla and it's like really like starting to move. And I didn't aware of that. Or maybe like I started getting a lot of crowding exposure where I didn't have any trades today, but there's been a lot of crowding that's moved into names that I'm concentrated in my portfolio. And so I didn't have a lot of crowding at first. I got ahead of the rest of the market, and now I actually have a lot of crowding exposure. That should be something that on a regular basis, you have the portfolio sub-agent saying like, hey, we have to look at the factor models and we want to see if we have any exposure that goes beyond a certain threshold. Here's the API to call out to this. Here's the data that it's running that risk decomposition on. And if it goes beyond a certain threshold, and you can explicitly set that, let's say it's more than 20% of our, let's say more than 5% of our volatility is in any one individual factor, send the email. And then, but when you do that, include the table, the query, and the actual analytics.
So you can reproduce it.
And so that's a scenario where I'm not asking the question right now, but I've said that at least up front once. Like, these are the questions that I need to be asking, and I'm busy. I don't have the ability to always go back to every one of these questions and run this run book. Like, some firms will put that in a deterministic script, and they would get like all of these PDFs and Excel files at the end of the day that a risk manager might flip through. Maybe they actually see it. But if you're using like this very cheap intelligence, clean data, and good context on how to interpret that data, I actually find that you don't necessarily need to, like, as long as you provide like some sort of citation on how to reproduce it, that's been good enough.
Yeah.
And for me, that's been the huge unlock, is using something like a Claude Code not to write code, but to actually use as the framework for how I'm doing more agentic like workflows in the background.
That's actually really impressive.
Yeah,
that's really impressive. That type of workflow. Wow.
Appreciate it. So last night, I'll tell you something. I had a Claude Code job running 20 Claude Code instances in parallel last night for over 22 hours, doing a complete analysis of a very large asset manager's like data warehouse, pulling down every table, every schema, looking at every stored procedure within the schema. And then I would have a sub-agent for every SPROC, stored proc, and have it evaluate the SQL query, go and look in the sys table for how many times it's been run since the server restarted, evaluate everything in the select clause that's an input and everything that's in the output. And then once you're done with that, go and query those tables. Make sure that you see what's in the underlying data, that you understand it, and then produce for me a very well-documented JSON file of these are the input tables, these are the output tables, based off of when it's run historically. This is what its expected like cron tab is. give me some context on it. And then there's thousands and thousands of potential stored, or thousands of stored procedures. And so each one of those instances, it was relatively expensive. It took around, I was calculating, let's say 50 cents per run, and it would be running a Claude Code instance, maybe running like 10 to 20 different SQL queries, and it would be non-deterministic because each stored procedure might be different. But at the end of that, I had a better understanding of what was going on within their data warehouse than any individual person within that organization. And all it was a CLI on a CLI, querying data and having good context around it.
Where was the data coming from in this place? In this case?
It would be coming from, let's say, like a portfolio management system, like an accounting system that has your end of day transactions, reconciled exposures. It might be coming from an upstream feed like a Bloomberg or Refinitiv for market data. It might also have like research data associated to that. So like what are like the internal estimates? Not going too much specifically into it, but like you have your accounting system, some sort of research system, various market data feeds, and other vendors as well. Like once you get into like a large asset manager, like that's like 10, 50, 100 billion larger, the amount of complexity they have in the enterprise is like absolutely bonkers. But also the amount of complexity that if you use it intelligently, something like Claude Code on a server or Codex or Open Code or Rue, I live and breathe with Claude Code. They can handle that complexity if you give them the right context and framework around it. And it's pretty wild. And so, like, kind of going back on that, how do you think about how you, I don't know, start exposing? Have you thought about starting exposing OpenBB CLI back to kind of Claude and like having it? You have the MCP, but like I found a lot of success with the CLIs.
Yeah, so we have like think two products, right? We have the workspace, which is like the more enterprise grade, and is like comes with no data, allows people to bring their data, bring AI agents. It's like sharing dashboards, order management, like all those things, right? Entity management, things like that. So and then we have the what we call the platform, which is the open source project with like 50,000 GitHub stars and things like that, right? And on that one, we're actually what we do like we wrap like all of these data, and we actually have a new product coming like very soon that basically is a GUI as a graphical user interface that you install locally that basically combines like all of these like data endpoints and allows you to consume that data in several different ways. So we're calling it like it's like a data platform, an open data platform essentially. And the way for you to consume data then, it can be anything. So because you are then running it on your machine, it becomes available as a REST API. But also you can click on a Jupyter notebook and everything gets installed because you just installed the data platform on your machine. And so it works like as an open alternative to BigQuant, for instance, from Bloomberg, right? But you can also click on the CLI and you start using the CLI of the product. Or you can click on the Python interpreter and you can run the functions directly. And so, and this one, like a contributor actually from the community, built an MCP server for a wrapping of all these data. And so now, like for instance, if you run this product and you add the MCP server extension, you have access to like 300, 400, 500 like endpoints that you can have access to an agent. And of course that's like too much, but then the contributor added the way to filter for the category that interests you. So if you only care about equity, you don't need to have like things like crypto or alternative data sets or like, government or something like that. And so like that data platform like is our play of the open like data space of like how teams should like, just contribute, because otherwise you're just doing the same thing, because you're going to need data. Like I don't see another solutions to this. You're always going to need data from multiple different data vendors that don't work well together. So whether you fix that problem for yourself, then someone else is going to have the same problem and do it themselves. And so that's why for us, this data platform has to be open for it to work and for it to be like a common contribution from multiple people. And we're going to start first with the official data sources, like the Bureau of Labor Statistics you mentioned, the International Monetary Fund, Congress, like FOMC minutes and things like that. But in the future, like we expect to like keep growing into like, other dimensions, but always first with the public open data sets in mind. But yeah, that's how we are thinking. And so the CLI that you use for Claude Code, like you'll be able to use with this product essentially, because for you it's all about the data. you actually are not after like a user interface, because you know full well what you want, and you have all of these tasks and sub agents that do things for you. You actually just need them to be exposed to more data to be able to increase their workflow. So you'll be able to plug our open source vendor with your API keys and your access onto it.
Awesome. Are you just off the top of it? Are you familiar with CyberSyn?
Yep. Yeah, Alex.
So, that was a really interesting project, and I think that's now part of like Snowflake Open Data.
Yep. Yep.
And they have some cool, like their security master seems really interesting. They got a lot of data from like Form 4 filings and Edgar. How do you compare something like that to like a CyberSyn?
The workspace or the data platform?
The data platform.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the data platform doesn't do like any storage or manipulation. It's more about like API connections, right? And so Snowflake is way more mature for like big like enterprise teams where you can like, not just like store the data, but then manipulate. And then it has like these like really big like data marketplace where like bigger firms like put and they handle like the pricing and the Snowflake credits then can go onto these data vendors. This is more like I think smaller-ish scale in terms of a data platform that just like routes all of these APIs into one place, and then you just set your API keys. So it's less enterprise ready. So actually the idea of the data platform was to be for individuals. Because like, for instance, when you bring like an API key, like for instance, you have access when you sign up, you are signing up with that API key for you, not for your entire firm. Now, having said that, with we are now kind of an early alpha, and we are seeing like enterprises actually asking for this. So we are finding ways to allow them to run these potentially like internally, but it still doesn't do any data storage or anything.
Sure.
So you'd always like need to fall onto like Snowflake for that type of work. And we used to actually the beauty of like the workspace, which is our commercial product, is that we used to show like case what you can build on top of Snowflake with data from CyberSyn, because they had a lot of open data. And so like we used to like connect, remember that it was like the crimes. It was one of the first demos that we done. We like integrated their crimes data. And then we'd ask the agents, it's like, what was the day with the most crimes in Chicago? And then it's like, go check the news to see what happened. And so you would show that you would get access to the SQL query to query for the right data. The data would switch on the widget, and then you would go search the web to understand on that day what happened. And so it showed like this very agentic workflow working on the workspace. So yeah.
Awesome.
So based on how you are using like Cloud Code today, like I'll say that I'm like pretty advanced in the space. We're talking like, with the head of AIs of all these companies and understand their workflows. You are like one step further than that. Like these Cloud Code sub-agents, like I'm a curious person. Like I spend all my evenings like playing with AI and like the edge of technology to like understand what's out there and how we can innovate the most. But like that's pretty edge even for me, right? Like this cascading of tasks or the CLI. Can you like tell me a bit more about like how you think about that, and if in the future, given what you are seeing, do you think that like investment firms are going to be like just 10 people managing like billions of dollars of capital, or how is it going to evolve? Because like you just said that like it was running for like 20 sub agents like for like 22 hours or something. It's like that's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy. I also live and breathe in it. Like I'm using Claude Code to generate emails, to sign contracts. Like another thing that we do is that I'm recording all of my conversations via Fireflies, transcribing it and downloading it, so that when at the end of that job run scans the databases, we also pull in context of all the conversations we had with the engineers around. We talked about a schema. What were the questions that we asked, and can that enrich the knowledge around the sprocs and the tables? One of the things we're starting to experiment with is that there's this AI company that will make calls, and we can then provide context around the call. So can we talk to an engineer? Can we talk to a subject matter expert and ask very targeted questions? It's driven by AI that then is identifying what are the gaps in our knowledge, what are the things we don't understand about what we've collected, and help kind of fill in the gaps there and start creating a flywheel that all of that is recorded, and that knowledge, that information that is distributed in like the wet CPUs of the employees and like the organization. People come and they go, and like retention is the death knell of an organization. Can you actually create that knowledge repository that's constantly collecting, that never leaves an organization, and it grows on itself? And so in a world where you can do that, I do see a world where you have asset managers, multi-billion dollars, sub 10 people, and a lot of the information flow and the decision making based off of the constructs of the context that the experts are giving that system and the really clean data, the system can start making decisions, micro decisions that build up to larger decisions very autonomously. And so, yeah, I do see a world where head count dramatically reduces. But in that same vein, I also think the trend of acqui-hires that you see at larger big tech companies like Scale AI, Facebook, starts cascading down outside of just big tech, where you might have somebody that understands how, like, the insurance industry incredibly well, but they also understand how you use AI effectively in some of the ways I'm describing of how we use it for asset management. And that person becomes incredibly valuable, and AI and the tooling makes them incredibly scalable. So that impact of that person becomes very high, and maybe the equity that if they're a founder, they're oftentimes like they're blood, sweat, and tears in that problem, and by the hardening of the diamond under that pressure, they become an expert on that domain and they've thrived in it. And so you might want to acquire that founder and be able to horizontally scale them with AI and their ability to use AI to solve this problem. But you might not necessarily need the technology and the IP that they built. And so I see a world where the acqui-hires of very talented AI-first organizations, founding teams, technologists become the main driver of value for an organization. The IP, value of equity or value of teams, and the IP that they actually built, if they know and they can articulate it very clearly, they would be able to reassemble it in a fraction of the time that it would take just to like integrate it. And so like the integration versus the rebuild, as long as that exists and that blueprint exists in their mind and they have some documentation around it, the IP, it can be rebuilt overnight. And so I see a world where, for example, like OpenBB, like maybe like I would see Bloomberg wanting to acquire something like that. One, you get network effects. So like it is a benefit if you have a bunch of distribution and you have a lot of people using it, but almost more importantly for just like the IP in and of itself, just by Didier and his core team that understand this space and they can use AI to very quickly scale out the same thing and help an organization transform. But like the IP, is it needed? And I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but like that's where I see the end game happening, like starting with big tech and cascading down.
So that's actually an interesting insight. So I think that's I see some parallels. So there's this company like I really like, is a startup called PostHawk for like recordings and analytics and stuff. And they have a really cool newsletter, and it's like for product engineers. And on the newsletter, they always mention when they hire for founders. They like to hire founders, ex-founders. And the reason they like to that is because like founders do a lot. They have a lot of autonomy. They get like shit done. And it feels like this is kind of what you're saying. It's kind of the same, but it's like this AI enabling, this scaling that these like teams that have been so deep right now at the edge of innovation. So you're kind of thinking that, okay, it's not like just taking whatever product this team have built, but it's like reinventing an industry, like a firm that already has cemented their position with customers, but building on top of that with everything that they learned through the AI. That's kind of your...
Absolutely.
Yeah, how do you think... So this is interesting. So just this week, I was checking on Twitter, and like the GPT-5 was announced, right? And OpenAI did one of those launch videos where there's like people next to each other. And someone on the timeline posted, they circled like one of the guys that was presenting, and they said, okay, Zuck is gonna poach this guy, like randomly. And like a few days later, like it literally got poached. He entered like Meta. And so like, how do you think that this is gonna play out? Do you think that like then teams are gonna be more like secret and like private around like who is building, who is there, like like crown jewels, or like how do you think that's going to impact? Because like, yeah, this is like, it's really bad, right? Because you want to like expose like someone in your team because of the work that they've done. You want to give them visibility, and then there comes like one of these like major labs with like, you know, infinite like capital, and they just like poach your best people. It's like,
yeah, I mean that's like talent retention is going to be one of the hardest things to do. Once the value of that talent becomes incredibly high, I think that sucks for the organization, but it's great for people. You know, like it's great for that person that gets that opportunity. And I think for the organization's responsibility is make sure that all of the knowledge that person had is retained as best as possible. Yeah. And so information acquisition, when you hire somebody that knows a lot of stuff, becomes one of the most important things for an organization that is AI enabled to make sure that when that person leaves, their innovation goes out the door, yes, but what about all of the context in which that innovation was being built on top of that you can retain before they leave, and hopefully you can then mitigate that. And then like, hey, they have equity in the long-term success of your company. So like, as long as they have their stock options vested and they're able to remain some level of exposure, like that knowledge can still be used within the org.
I find it really weird that like in the hedge fund world, right, there's garden leave, but there isn't with AI labs, where I think that the technology and the tricks that they use for RL and everything like there is like way more like important around like, you know, the reach of AGI. Yeah. And that never came, like I never heard someone on a garden leave, you know, they just like switch like this from one lab to the other. And that's crazy, right?
Yeah. I mean, like it's California. So like California is known for not supporting non-competes. And so where it's actually like the garden leave gets you, it's not on the contractual non-compete, but it's on the deferred comp. And so it may change the compensation structure for some of these labs where you can have a non-compete. And that says like you and the organization have contractually agreed that you will not work for a competitor, and it would be like a breach of this contract for you to do that. And so like that's a contractual obligation. But where a lot of the non-competes come from is the concept of a deferred compensation within a hedge fund. So if you work for a hedge fund, part of your compensation is in cash, and that's yours. Generally speaking, it doesn't have a clawback. Some do have clawbacks, and a PM might have that. But also some of that money goes into the fund. And you can get that as long as you adhere to their rules. And some of those rules will be for 2 years after you leave, you can't go to a competitor. Now you can, it's nothing stopping you, but if you do, all of that money it comes back. And so then if you're in a situation like some of these labs will be in, they'll change the compensation structure so that they will give some level of like guaranteed equity or cash. And it's all yours as long as you don't go to a competitor within 1 year after you leave. And so you sit that out. So it's not actually a non-compete. It's more of a structure of the compensation that can get clawed back. Because it's not technically, it's unvested. It's essentially unvested cash. And so starting to use some of those techniques, I'm sure are like everyone probably that has a person that's afraid of getting poached with that high of value to the org plus that high of value to somebody else is going to start have to rethink those compensation structures. Yeah. There's also very complicated clauses in some non-competes that aren't just about a non-compete that you can't go anywhere competitive, but you can't go anywhere competitive for potentially a longer term and work with somebody that you've worked with in the past. And so those clauses also exist. I have gone very deep into a lot of these because I've had to deal with them myself. And so some non-competes are about not working with a previous coworker. So like if you're one of these labs and maybe you do have somebody that you've poached and like you've accepted that, they then can't work with anyone else, even if they're not soliciting them, but they can't work anywhere else or with anyone that they previously worked with kind of in any capacity. And so those sometimes get challenged a little bit, but that's an additional limitation that you might have. And so like deferred comp and non-competes, although those aren't allowed within California, are probably going to have to start entering the picture because it's too much kind of equity at stake. I do think on the scenario of being able to retain or extract information from someone before they leave starts to become an interesting dynamic, because then there's a question of like how much, when somebody goes and works at a company, are they coming up with new ideas versus implementing ones that they already know about. Yeah. And if it's something where they're just implementing best practices or something that they already know, opposed to having them have to actually implement, if you could just have them explain, blueprint, and diagram, and then the AI or some other system can do the implementation, the long-term value of that person in the organization is somewhat lower if you can extract that value up front. Now, like, this is a very like dehumanizing way to think about it, but it's also could be empowering, where you could go, let's say you have a PM or an analyst that really understands the supply chain space, and you want to say like, hey, I'll pay you $50,000 for working with us for 1 week, and I want to have you talk to our AI and our internal interrogator. We're going to record everything. We're going to give you different scenarios, have you describe that, and then you can go on your way. And so 1 week of work, 50 grand, 100 grand, $1 million if they're like really strong at what they do. And can you scale that? Can you now interview like 100 different analysts in different sectors, and opposed to having to pay them full-time salaries for an entire year, can you get 90% of that value off of a 1 to 2 week long intensive structured interrogation, and make sure that information gets indexed into a knowledge repository and an asset that can continue to be leveraged and be part of that flywheel? And I think that'll have to become part of the metrics in terms of like retaining talent, structuring information, dealing with scenarios where a lot of the implementation, the work, can start being passed off to some of these very cheap intelligence layers.
It's like an internal expert network, right?
Exactly.
In a way, yeah.
Exactly.
Like Tigos,
internal expert and external, right?
And
like
external,
the role, and expert networks are getting very restrictive on what you can do on these expert network calls. It's a very big business. They definitely want to make sure they retain that, like no recording of it. And I think when we were talking about Kirk earlier, that's where he kind of like got his initial kind of Kickstarter, where he built out that essentially internal proprietary research team when he was at Point 72. So he knows that space really well. But I definitely think the expert network is it's very prime for disruption. I wish I could remember the name of this tool. We'll share it in the show notes. But it's trivial. It's not great AI, and you sometimes get these robocalls, and you might know it's a robocall. But making that available for anyone that needs to be able to understand a new domain quicker, they could find, hey, like I need to figure out how to integrate with, let's say, Arcesium. And they're a very popular shadow nav back office outsourcing team that has like a pretty cool Databricks Delta table product called Aquata. Anyways. Let's say I want to understand that a little bit better. Well, send out a bunch of LinkedIn messages for people that work there and say like, hey, on your commute home, for $50 an hour, I'd love for you to just chat with one of our AIs and explain how like the integration stuff works. And you can do that then for like various different things to enhance your enterprise knowledge graph for gaps that you have.
That's actually a place where MCP server consumption makes a ton of sense, because the only defensible mode of those expert networks is on the proprietary data, because you are competing with the data in the entire web. So like every comment, every podcast where someone talks about like a product, like you are competing with data from there. So you need to produce data that is like net new effectively, right?
Yeah.
And so, but all data is not created equal. So what I think might happen is that these expert networks will implement like MCP server and charge a lot for the consumption.
They absolutely will.
You are getting, like you are asking a prompt, but you are getting a definite answer that they will have that you will not find on the internet. So it's like you are buying asymmetrical information, which is worth a lot of money because you know that your competitors won't have.
Totally.
So that's actually an interesting one.
Well, and they're also in a situation where they don't have like a UI platform that they're worried about cannibalizing.
Yeah, they don't, because you don't need, because you just you just want to know an answer. And I mean, most of the times, right? Like if you talk about the topic, maybe you want to see the entire conversation if you are getting into the topic, but you can get that from the web. Like if you're trying to understand like how a business works or how do they make money or margins, like ChatGPT gives you really good answers with access from the web, because you can find these things on like Reddit. Like someone in the history has talked about this, like for sure, like, you know. But what is that like extra thing that ChatGPT doesn't know that these expert networks? The hard part, I think, is going to be like, how can you highlight that extra information that you have? Do you know what I mean? It's like, how can you prove that you have data that is worth paying a high margin for? Because if I go to you and I ask a question that I cannot find on ChatGPT, like how can I find a good source for it, and you don't have it, I'm going to lose complete trust. But how can you know? Because each question that someone is going to come to you is a question that does not exist on the web. Otherwise, you just ask the web. So it's like, do you know what I mean? It's going to be quite tricky for these expert networks to highlight that they have data that doesn't exist in the web, and that data is worth a lot of money, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I do like the ability of being able to do very quick trial data with MCP. So like we'll give you temporary access to MCP.
Yeah.
One of your analysts, you get at least 10 questions
Yeah.
and see what it's like. And then like if those answers are really good, you're hooked.
But that's going to be how you're going to determine a system, which is really weird because you're used to use software, right? You use the software, like it works, you're good. You know, there's a bug, you're like, okay, your confidence goes down. Then you don't see bugs, you know, you love it. And it's really weird with AI. You do this trial period, and it's based on the output of those questions. But those questions are going to be completely different than somebody else. And so, like, your intuition of the product, you're going to say, I love this product, it's the best, based on those 10 questions. But the questions that you are asking, it's not what like when you use a software like SaaS, like the company knows what people are going to do. They control, it's deterministic. But in this case, like the question can be anything. And it's not just about the data. It's also about the underlying model that they are using, always consuming the data. And so like the bar is just so high, because if those 10 answers are not really good, you're just going to tell everyone, no, this sucks. You know, even though if they have like really good data on semiconductors, which is an industry that you didn't care because you're just you looking at health, you know, healthcare. So it's going to be like really interesting to see how that evolves.
I'm sure there's some, like I haven't looked into a lot of the evaluation models, and Thomas gave an example one on the last episode of like how well ChatGPT does without a Delupa connector and how well it does with it. It's very clear that it's like effective. It's like you're not going to be good at answering financial data if you don't have access to a financial data system. But being able to do like a proper eval of like historical, like let's say there's an eval network for doing historical stock analysis, or like going into an earnings call, did you get the right call out, and being able to do with and without, and so like an eval for that. But yeah, it's gonna be fascinating, and figuring out how you sell data and justify the cost is gonna be an interesting problem that data vendors are gonna have to deal with, especially when it starts having these human-like decision-making processes. It has to lean on different evals. But evals have to continue to get better.
But then it's going to be also interesting from what you said. It's like if MCP as a protocol is accepted, which you know it is, it's like all data companies, you have to assume that they're going to have like an MCP server. So it's like for companies that have the same like earnings data, like how are you competing against them? Like, do you know what I mean? It's
well,
like,
that's going to be a drive to the bottom, right? Like that's a race to the bottom if they're not differentiated.
Exactly. Because if you have the software, for instance, you compete at the application layer, as in like how do you use the product, what's the experience, what allows you, what unlocks you. But if you are pushing data onto a sharding interface, which is the same for everyone else, like how do you differentiate from another vendor that has the same data? You need to go back. It's never about like, oh, you can do this on the sharding interface, because you can do that as well with other data. Is like, why is this data as the context of this AI model the best one? And so it goes back to the data. It's like, is it because you're acquiring data faster? Is it because your team is like, 1,000 people and you can like make sure that the data is like spotless? Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's going to be really hard to show that.
Totally. I mean, but it's going to be an interesting, like, how much do you want to enrich the data as well? Like maybe you just have the raw earnings dates data, but maybe you also contextualize, this is an earnings date that is for a semi company. This is an earnings that you could add a little bit more. Like this is a high vol earnings date based off of options data. And some clients want that. Like if you are more of a fundamental client, like you maybe want some of that richness, and it's getting closer to like what's some of these vendors are adding on the UI side where they contextualize. But if it's more of a quant business, depending on how they're using AI, they could still be MCP consumers, right? But they might just be doing more systematic analysis. They might just say, like, just give me raw, clean, accurate earnings data. Yeah. And you can start differentiating in the MCP server side, where some might start including more intelligence in the query, and some is a very simple layer on top of a SQL query.
So I actually know a company doing something around that, like extra metadata. So just to give some context. So for instance, on a workspace, when you bring a data onto the product, you have the underlying data that you see, whether it's a table, a chart, live data. And then you have what we call metadata, which is like the name of the widget, the description, the category, the subcategory, and then the source. And those are important for the AI to know what to query. Because if I ask, like, what is the price of Tesla yesterday? Or I say, what is the price of like Bitcoin yesterday? Those might be two different widgets, and it needs to understand like which one to use to query the API to get access to the data, right? And then I found out about this company, and it's called like Parsim. And what they do is that they enrich like data. So for instance, like let's say there's an API vendor that has like these tables, and they create these metadata around the endpoint so that agents are better at querying that endpoint, which is really interesting, because what you're saying is like it's not just about the underlying database, like what are the context around it that it makes it better for an agent to query. And maybe then the MCP server is the UI distribution, because you can put that extra context on the tool that gets asked. So instead of having a get data, you have get right metadata, and then the get right metadata is the one that gets the data. So you have like, or one other use case that I've seen recently is not just having an agent that gives you like an output, but having a mini agent that does like a prompt enhancement. So instead of the analyst just says like, write me a report for this company, and the prompt enhancement takes that prompt and understands the company is in the healthcare, and so here are the fields we want a macro outlook, we want you to, and so it takes on and it creates this very complex prompt. But the analyst just wrote write a draft letter, and so that's gonna be super interesting.
Yeah, man. The future's here.
Oh man, I love it.
On Hacker News this week, I saw a really, what I thought was an interesting article. It didn't click for me at first, but I was talking to somebody about it earlier today, from Astral, and they're the creators of UV, and they came out with PyX, and that's going to be their like PyPI repo repository for packages, specifically for Python. And at first, like, UV is such a cool product. Like, why is the next thing that they're going for going to be a package manager that's remotely hosted? And one of the things that I realized actually is going to be pretty cool, and I think actually you posted on this a little bit, of like the value of having smaller models or finely tuned models that are privately run, and that's kind of hard to set up. Figuring out what your GPU is locally, getting your GPU and like even like configured in a way that could be usable, and then getting your PyTorch environment set up is like very tedious. And that's one of the first things that they're approaching, is how you can configure a GPU prepped package for integrating with UV to very quickly download it and install. And in the context of what I'd mentioned earlier around UV being very powerful to on the fly create a CLI or use a CLI from a language model within Claude, combining those two concepts together, where Claude is, or something like a CLI tool, is calling out to various different tools dynamically, making decisions, working in a flywheel-like environment. If it identifies that there are certain decisions that it's making, and maybe it's like you're tracking all the decisions that this agent is doing, and there's another whole evaluation model that's also running in the background and tweaking, and it identifies like, oh, this model is constantly misinterpreting a couple different key terms. We've already tried to tweak the context or the system prompt, and it's not working effectively. I want to download a new model, train it, and run it autonomously while everything else is running, and then start A/B testing whether or not this new finely tuned model is actually better, and have that not be done by a person making that decision, but the actual the model running alongside the production system, making that or driving that insight, having something like PyX from Astral, where it works on any environment. As long as you have a GPU, it'll figure out like what GPU you have, what are the different tweaks for installing PyTorch, making sure that it runs, going in and pulling in an open weight model, looking at the different things that the actual production system is doing and start finely tuning that, and then occasionally tweaking the actual model that's being used. Maybe it's coming from an Anthropic, and now it wants to test out this finely tuned model, like, oh, this is actually better, and make that switch autonomously. Having a system that makes pulling and building that repository very quickly easy to do by the model itself would be like pretty awesome, because right now, like, it's hard for a human, but making that something that it has like, oh wow, it's just already done experience you have with UV would be pretty fascinating. And I think if they could get that, I think that'd be really interesting. And there's another element that, like, as I'm doing more autonomous work with Claude Code on servers, that being able to limit what Claude Code can actually do starts becoming like important, and limit the compute, limit the network access. Because like as those jobs are running in the background, there's a possibility that it could accidentally make I see a comment that this is meant to send out an email. Let me check that email to see if I can actually send it to it. And now it's generating a Python function, making an SMTP server, sending out an email when all it was supposed to be doing was scanning a database. Controlling the compute environment and the runtime execution suddenly becomes very important. Yep. And if Astro wants to, like, hey, we have the package management, and then now we can easily control the compute environment that these agents can run in, I think it would be an awesome next play.
But that's a problem with the MCP as well, which is there's this guy called like Simon that has like a really cool blog post, and he calls about this trifecta problem, which is like I don't really remember it, but basically you like, if you give access to the MCP server to like tools, and then the user is controlling like the client and the experience, like you can actually be in a position that they can actually do something nefarious. And so like I think that's going to be like, and it's the same of what you said, is like, how do you prevent that? Because if you want autonomy, you need to give more control to Claude Code or wherever. But at the same time, then if it has too much, like what is too much autonomy if you want it to be fully autonomous? So it's like, it's kind of a hard problem, right? And I think that's going to be...
Especially when you give it access to Bash. Like
exactly. It can do anything.
You can do anything if you have access to a Bash tool.
That was one of the most interesting things for me, was when I started understanding that the way the Claude Code works was different from other coding agents, where it wasn't RAG on the code base. It was literally just doing like sed and things, commands, like literally like humans, like going to files, understanding the folder. And I was like, this is like mind-blowing, because like it just goes to show that these agents, the best agents, like literally mimic how humans like do things, right? Because that's literally the process. And so when you see it, I'm just mind-blown, because I'm like, this is how I would be doing it as well, and the way he's thinking about it. And I think that like the major thing that Claude achieved was not just a really good model for coding, but also the list of instructions. Like he just does things like a human does, like a really good engineer does. And that's just like, that's awesome to see, Another thing as well there is like, I wrote a post about this like more than a year ago, like a year and a half, about like small models, and how I believe like, open source and small models. But there was a thing that happened to me like recently that I was like, damn, like this really made me shift my perspective, which is I was on the first plan from Claude, the $20 a month, and I was running actually through the limit pretty much every day. And when I run onto the limit, I would go to Gemini, because Gemini was free and it's a decent model. The problem was that I started getting so used to Claude Code quality that it started upsetting me to using Gemini and not having it being the same quality. Even if Claude Code wasn't able to do it, for me, I would test Gemini, and if he couldn't do it, I'm like, if I was using Claude, I would have it done. So I ended up upgrading. And like, I don't even know if that's true, like it's the same task. Maybe like Claude Code couldn't do it either. But because in my mind, I wasn't using the best model in the market, like I felt that the others like are just not good enough, and you're much better paying whatever, because it's worth the time to implement the feature, to push the product forward. And it's just like something that I never thought before, because I always thought that, like open source models are getting like better and better, and the closed ones are not like exponential. So the gap is closing, right? Like is a function of time, right? For the gap to close and close. And I used to say that it's like the models of today, for instance, open source, are much better than the closed source of like, a year ago or something like that. And people used to use those and be like super happy about their outcomes. But because now there's a new bar, I feel like maybe the gap has to be like so close and so tight for you to even think about going to an open weight model, unless like, it's a security, is running internally, of course. But yeah, that's just something that changed a bit in my mind recently.
But if you can have like very bespoke, finely tuned models for each individual use case, like there are opportunities to be able to get
correct
better performance, but it's not a silver bullet for everything.
And I feel like the models, then the improvements between each base model needs to slow down. Because otherwise, you are fine-tuning a model that there's going to be a new release in 3 months, and it's much better than your fine-tuned version where you spent a lot of money and cycles, like, fine-tuning. And so I feel like at some point, that's 100% the case. But yeah, and I think probably we're getting there, because models aren't getting, like, crazily better, like, in each cycle. It's not like from 3.5 to 4 was, for instance.
And like, you're starting to get more of, like, well, what's the UX then? So if the models aren't that differentiated, what's the UX of Claude versus Codex? Or how does it integrate with my hyperscaler? Or like, what's the data connectivity experience? There's like, I haven't tried it out yet, but AWS recently came out with the Agent Core runtime, and it's a way to be able to create a Lambda for agentic execution. So the same way, like you can create like a Python function, and let's put that in a Lambda. It gets a post request. It then executes maybe a fast API endpoint or a node endpoint, returns back data. Agent Core is built around like, hey, we want to put your agent. Maybe it's running a lane graph execution DAG, or it's running like a Claude Code like instance, although it's not quite working with Claude Code yet. And let it just run for a indeterminate amount of time, give it access to data via how Bedrock manages like network gateways and permissions, and then be able to farm that out. Because there's a non-trivial amount of infra and compute and network management to be able to parallelize a lot of agentic frameworks when they might be doing non-trivial compute. And like we had to build a lot of that where we would like Dockerize every run of Claude Code, and then we only have so many different containers. We weren't deploying it on Kubernetes. We were thinking like, oh, what file systems are mounted? And it becomes like a hard problem of figuring out that runtime. And AWS has just started to put it out there. And so I'm assuming the other hyperscalers will start having something too, and like a GCP and an Azure. And then how these things start farming, I think and the dependencies start getting really fascinating. It's a really cool time to be building.
It's the best time to be building.
Yeah. And with that, Dieter, dude, thanks so much for coming on. I'm so glad we could do this after a couple years. And thanks for everyone for tuning in. So again, my name is Michael Watson. This is the Hedgineer Podcast. We push out episodes to YouTube, hit the subscribe button, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, even on TikTok. And if you have any questions, feel free to message below in the comments. And until the next episode, take it easy.